I am Tara Moore, and I'll be here for you all in case you have any questions or need anything NCWF wise. And just to go over some of the logistics of Zoom, I'm sure you guys have been on a lot of Zoom calls before, but if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can put your question in the chat, and that will look like this. I just said a hi in the chat, so you can throw your questions over there. You can also put them in the question and answer box, which is over there. I'll make sure to check both of them. Or if you like to speak out loud, you can raise your hand and we will call on you after the presentation. So that is really all we have logistics wise. You will be on mute for the whole time unless we unmute you to ask a question at the end. And we can't see you, but hi everyone that is there. I can see we have a good amount of people on the call now. So at this point, I am going to turn over to Lenny. Lenny is, I call him a moth expert. I think he may say moth enthusiast, moth lover, moth supporter, I don't know what, but he's a moth expert in my book. And I've been to a few of the moth nights with him that have just been so much fun. And I'm just really excited to get to hear Lenny talk about moths here tonight to all of us. So thank you for being here, Lenny, and feel free to take it away. I'll make sure that your screen gets shared properly and everything, and then we can get rolling.
Awesome, great. Thank you, Tara. And thank you all for being here. And I know, taking your time out of busy schedules to sit in on these meetings is tough. All through this pandemic, there's been so many great ones, and I always like, oh, I got to sit in on this one. I've got to catch this one, and life gets busy, and you end up missing a lot of the ones that you want to. But it's just encouraging to see a bunch of people that are actually tuned into this to listen about moths. So thank you all for taking the time to do that. I'm gonna kind of roll through everything that, not that I know about. I mean, you go on for hours with moths, but I have a whole bunch of slides that represent, just some really nice pictures of moths, but as well as, the work that we're doing in Mecklenburg County that's related to moths. So we got into this game a number of years ago, and we're still, I think, in the infancy stages. We're still trying to build our moth list. There is just so much to learn. I'm a natural resources supervisor with Mecklenburg County, with their Park and Recreation Division of Nature Preserves and Natural Resources, which is always a mouthful to say. But our group does a lot of different things, and our primary goal is to manage over 8,000 acres of nature preserve land in the county. And we have a team of about 10 full-time and several part-time that are doing this work. And I'll go over some of that as well in the program, because it all ties together and it all relates to moths and everything in the natural environment, has connections, which I'm going to talk about as well. But we're doing lots of different things. So the moth thing, we got into a number of years ago. And like I say, it's just fascinating. I mean, I didn't know anything about it until we jumped into it. And I'm constantly learning. I wish we had more time to commit to it. It's sort of like a part-time thing that we do, balancing all other responsibilities. But, every time we have a chance to do some moth work, we're building our list, we're building our knowledge base. And I'm just going to kind of stop talking, because everything I want to tell you is all in the presentation. So I'm going to get ready to share my screen, and then I'm going to fly through, some really nice pictures of moths, and like I said, pictures that represent the work that we're doing with them. And of course, at the end, there'll be time if you have some questions that you want to throw in the chat, and we'll go over all that as well. So I'm going to fire away, see if I can get this rolling. Okay, so I think Tara is the one who came up with the actual title for tonight, The Marvelous Moths of North Carolina. Discoveries in the Darkness. And I do a few different moth presentations. I always kind of throw that subtitle in there, because I think that's one of the fascinating things about it, is that we're constantly making new discoveries. And, like I said, we've been doing this a number of years, but there's just, every time you go out mothing, you're seeing something new and you're learning something new. But to begin, I'm going to start with some basics. If I can get this working, right? There we go. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the separation between moths and butterflies. So they're together in the same scientific grouping, known as, there's, I think, 32 or 33 different orders or groupings of insects. Butterflies and moths are together in the scientific order Lepidoptera. Lepido meaning scale, ptera meaning wing. So these insects have scales on their wings, which allows them to have colors and patterns that most other insects don't have. So in the butterfly world, they're beautiful. They get all the attention, but the moth end of the spectrum has pretty much been disregarded, except by the few people willing to take the time to look at them. But superficially, they look a lot alike. So sometimes it gets hard to separate a moth from a butterfly. There's, for the most part, butterflies are out in the daytime, moths are out at night. There are some day flying moth species that I'll show you pictures of. And every once in a while, we see a butterfly out at night too. But the real difference in when you're separating butterflies and moths really comes down to the antennae. So if you look at this butterfly, this is a common buckeye, their antennae end in these little rounded knobs. And there's some variation in how those can look. This is a common checkered skipper. Its antennal knobs are kind of hooked a little bit, but there's always some structure there at the end of the antennae, some knob-like structure. With moths, there's a few different styles of antennae they can have. They can have what's known as a filiform type antennae, like in this zale, where it's just kind of a straight filament. This is a horrid zale. Some of these things have great names too. This one has an antennae with a little comb-like structure. And that's known as a pectinate antennae in this deep yellow euclina. This is a tulip tree silk moth, and it has that same type of, off the main antennal structure. There's that comb-like thing, and then it also kind of falls on both sides of the antennae, which gives it the term for that is bipectinate, or sometimes those little structures are split, and it's known as quadrupectinate. So, different forms of antennae not ending in the little club segments like you see in the butterflies. But that's really the main difference. So what's really interesting is that the butterflies, and moths, again, all part of this scientific order Lepidoptera, the diversity in butterflies is a lot smaller than it is in moths. As a matter of fact, if you take that scientific order and you break it down into all the super families that make up the Lepidoptera, and you look at this list, you're going to see that they are all moths, with the exception of one super family, the Papilionoideae, which is the butterflies and the skippers. All the other superfamilies are moths. And you can look at some of these families, and they're probably no more or less related to each other than they would be related to this superfamily. So in the whole spectrum of Lepidoptera, what you're looking at are all superfamilies of moths, with this one superfamily here, which are the butterflies and skippers. So basically, they're day-flying moths. When you really think about it, they are just one little different group among this whole spectrum of moths, which, like I say, some of them can be sort of related to each other, some of them are very distantly related, and no less related than they would be to the butterflies. Skippers used to be in their own superfamily, and then they've actually put them with the butterflies. If you see some older publications, they'll sometimes list, butterflies and skippers and make that distinction between the two, but now they've been lumped together in one superfamily. But superficially, skippers are smaller. They can almost look like more of a mothish type butterfly, but again, they do have antennal clubs. Some of them do have a little pectinate type comb structure, but it is at the tip of the antenna. So in this whole spectrum of Lepidoptera, where you can see, it's almost all moths with one little grouping of butterflies, the whole moth end of the spectrum kind of gets this perception. This is what most people think about it. And, maybe not a lot of us that are here tuning in tonight, but for the general public, moths are these things that just kind of flit around your porch lights. They're drab, they're gray, they're annoying, they're small. But when you think of the other end of the spectrum and you think about the butterflies, this is the attention they get. Like I mentioned before, they're the bright, colorful, beautiful thing, insects. They have the scales on their wings allow them to have those patterns and colors, but it's true of moths as well. But, this is the image that the butterflies, or at least the perceived image of the butterflies. But, part of what I want to do tonight is kind of, I'm here to build appreciation for moths. If this was a butterfly talk, I'd be all about the butterflies, but, tonight it's about the moths. So I want to highlight some of the beauty that exists in the moth world. And this is probably my personal favorite. And I would say that this moth is as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than any butterfly species out there. This is a native species that exists in eastern North America. It's the Cecropia moth. It's, I think, our largest moth, that and the Polyphemus, but just beautiful colors on this one. So definitely rivals any butterfly. And then the moth world has some things that the butterfly world doesn't have. So, you got more shapes and patterns and different kind of things. You have the Luna moth, which, has a very ethereal, almost kind of magical feel. You don't really get that from butterflies. You have cute and fuzzy in the moth world. I don't know how much you get that from butterflies either. But the black wave flannel moth, this is like a little tiny puppy dog with wings. They're just adorable little creatures. And then there's the patterns to the wings. I think whenever we do these kind of moth nights, I always kind of point out that, if there's any artists that are, joining us, that, they can totally get into moths and totally appreciate it as much as anyone else, if not more, because there's so much artistry in the design of these things. And just, not even if they're not colorful, but just kind of the shapes of the wings and the structure and the way they hold themselves. So this angel, what a beautiful little creature. Virginia creeper sphinx, some of these sphinx moths have kind of sleek fighter jet style, not behavior, but the way they kind of hold themselves. I don't know what to say about the Hagmoth. This is just a strange little creature, but fascinating. You see something like this land on a moth sheet, and it doesn't even look like a moth. It's hard to say what it really looks like, but it's just, part of the diversity that exists in this moth world. The brown scoop wing. You can just look at the way these wings, that the patterning, and it's got, lobes, almost like a leaf on a tree would. They're just incredible. And even if they don't have, like a unique design, or wing structure or anything like that, just some of the patterns and designs on them and the colorations, like this oval based prominent. And you don't really notice this until you get up close to them. So, it could be that moth that's just flitting around your head at the porch light. But then, if you're doing something where you're out at night looking at them with a sheet and a black light, that's where you get a chance to really observe this beauty that exists. So, and when they're on a sheet, you can usually get up close to them. They don't move, they don't frighten very easily. And you can just kind of stick your face really close up to these things and just, appreciate, how unique each species looks. The Parthenice tiger moth, another just beautiful markings and colors and patterns. And then, what can be greater in this world than the common Lepidoptera? Look at this beautiful little creature. All right, yeah, well, there are boring little drab moths as well. So yeah, in that world of moth diversity, you're gonna have plenty that, maybe don't have anything exciting on their, on their wings to look at. There's no incredible colorations or unique wing designs or anything like that. They're just drab. But the thing about this common Lepidoptera, and true of any species, is that even though it doesn't, look that interesting to us, it's no less important than any other moth species. So this insect's playing, important roles in the natural environment the same way, a beautiful Luna moth would be. Even though it doesn't, to us, it might not look that visually appealing. But all these species have very important things that they're doing in the environments, and they have, connections to our plants and to our wildlife in both stages, in the adult stage and in the juvenile stage where they exist as caterpillars. which for a lot of species, occurs much longer than the adult form. Oops, sorry, let's get past that. So caterpillars have, in some cases, direct relationships to some of our plant species. So this caterpillar will be found on a dogbane leaf. And the reason it's found on a dogbane leaf, it's because it's a dogbane Saccharomyces moth. And that's the host plant for that particular moth species. That's what its caterpillars are going to eat. That's what they're going to live on. That's where the adults are going to lay their eggs. So most of its life is spent on this one plant species, on dogbane, also known as Indian hemp. So there's these direct relationships between certain moths and certain plant species. So that's, you think of plant insect connections, a lot of times you'll think milkweed and monarch butterflies, but there's a moth equivalent in that relationship as well. So the milkweed tussock moth, its caterpillars feed on milkweed leaves, all the local species of milkweeds. What's interesting, if you look at the caterpillars, they're orange, white, and black, the same colorations as the adult monarch butterflies. And you'll see that coloration with some other insects, some of the beetles that feed on milkweed as well. And, there's that relationship between the toxic sap of milkweed and the warning colors in nature being orange, white, and black, or sometimes yellow, white, and black, being a sign that that animal could be poisonous. So it's sending a signal to birds or other potential predators to don't waste its time eating it because you'll get sick. So American holly, a common small tree that we have in our woodlands, if you look closely sometimes, you might see this little green caterpillar feeding on it, and that's the caterpillar of the black-dotted ruddy moth. So again, a direct relationship, this is the host species for that moth. And that's the one type of tree that you're gonna find that caterpillar feeding on those leaves. And then you'll see some, what we call generalists. So, those were the specialists. They have direct relationships with maybe one or two different species, or maybe it's just one genus with several different species in it that they'll feed on. But then there's some that feed on a wide range of species. So the Luna moth is a good example of this. So its caterpillars will feed on persimmon, sweet gum, hickory, black walnut, sumac, alder, elm, American hornbeam, willow, and ash. So, a wider range of plant genera and species that these caterpillars will feed on. So they're generalists. The same can be said about the red-humped caterpillar moth. And again, just to go through the list, sweet gum, black walnut, hickories, river birch, black cherry, cottonwood, redbud, blackberry, and willow. So it's just interesting how some caterpillars will feed on a wider range of leaves of different species, while others have those kind of direct relationships. There's a lot to learn about a lot of this too. Some we're not sure what they're doing. I mean, if you look up moths online, sometimes, and I'll talk about resources for all that and everything coming up, but when you actually figure out what you're looking at, and you can go to a website and where there's information about a certain species, a lot of times for host plants, it might say unknown. Or sometimes we feel like we know a little bit about them, but there's still things they must feed on it because they occur in places where the host plants aren't found. And that's the case with the friendly pearl bowl. So it feeds upon sourwood. And this next map will show you, this is the range of sourwood, very much a southeastern species. And then if you look at the range of the moth, I mean, it occurs into the northeast, it occurs in the west too. So it's certainly feeding on other leaves besides those of just sourwood. It's just, we're not sure yet. So that's the other interesting thing about this whole moth world, and I don't think I've pointed out yet, is that there is just so much that we don't know. And there's still so much to learn about these things. We just don't know what some of them are doing in their life cycles. This is a hickory tussock moth, and it feeds on, again, a wide range of food plants, hickory, oak, ash, maple, elm, sumac, and Virginia creeper. So what's interesting about this one is this is its range, So, we're here in the, southern Piedmont of North Carolina. All of those, go back to that slide, all of those host plants, hickories, oak, ash, maple, elm, sumac, and Virginia creeper are all common in our region. So why don't we have this species here? Why is this mostly isolated to the mountains of North Carolina and to the Northeast? So, again, sometimes they seem to occur in places where the known host plants don't exist, and other times they're absent from places where we do have their host plants. So again, there's still so much to learn about these insects. So one of the most important things, and that's true of any insects, their roles in the natural world, is the role of pollination. I think it's over 90% of plant species rely on insects and small animals to pollinate them and, to drag pollen from one flower to another. And that's in order for successful reproduction to happen. A few tree species are wind pollinated, but the vast majority of plant species rely on insects and other small animals for pollination. And moths play a major role in this. You might not be seeing it because a lot of moths are out at nighttime and not in the daytime. But if you do see some of the day flying species like this Ailanthus webworm moth, you can see them actively, moving from flower to flower like they're doing on this eupatorium, and they're successfully fulfilling that role of pollination. A couple of day flying species are the snowberry clearwing and the hummingbird clearwing. They are very visible in the summer months and common, and you can see them flitting around from flower to flower. Again, helping the flowers achieve their pollination goals. So there are some species that you don't really think about moths as pollinators that much, but this leaf, at least in our part of the state, I'd say is probably our most common woodland orchid species. And you'll see these green leaves in summer, and you can kind of see that purplish underside to them. In the summer months, you'll see this little flower spike come up. It's kind of fragile, it's not very visible unless you happen to be right upon it. And I was on a listserv with some botanists, and they were discussing this plant species, and anyone asked if anybody knew about what was pollinating it. And there was actually one researcher that I think had a student involved in some work on this plant or something. But anyway, they were discussing that there was a species of moth known as the armyworm moth, and they had discovered that to be a pollinator. And as far as they know, that was the only species they've been able to say for sure that's actually pollinating cranefly orchid. So this is the adult. They're also called the white speck, the armyworm moth. And I'm sure there's other things pollinating it. It must be hard, especially for night flying moths, to figure out what they're doing at night and what they're pollinating. Because of course, if you use a light, they're probably going to fly to the light and not to the plants that they should be pollinating. So it's tricky work to do. And I'm sure there's other moth species that are pollinating it, but at the very least, they think cranefly orchid is pretty much primarily moth pollinated. And the only known species doing that is this armyworm moth. So here's a case where, there's this little brown moth. So again, we talked about, like the common Eupithecia, drab little moth. This is the only known pollinator for our most common woodland orchid species. So, if this little brown moth disappeared, that might affect the survival of, that orchid species that a lot of us know and love. So suddenly a little brown moth has, a higher level of importance to us. Its status is elevated because we know it's doing something important. And for the others, they are as well. We're just, a lot of times we don't have that knowledge base yet for exactly what they're doing in the natural environment. We know they're an important food source in both stages, in the adult stage and in the caterpillar stage. So this anole certainly has a mouthful. But you start thinking about some of the bird species. You think about whippoorwills, who are undergoing these, incredible declines. And a lot of it has to do with a decline in their food sources. And we're going to talk about that as well. But, it's such an iconic bird. That's the sound of night in the country is the call of the whippoorwill. And you're just not hearing it in a lot of places anymore. And there's a lot of factors involved, and certainly habitat loss is a factor and stuff like that. But the decline of their food sources is, and moths being one of their major food sources, is a big concern as to why this species might be, declining at the rate that it is. And then you look at some of the neotropical migrant species, some of these suites of birds, the warblers, tanagers, vireos that spend the winter in the tropics and move back through our area in the spring. Some stay here and will nest in the late spring, early summer. Others are just kind of moving through to points further north. But they have these dramatic flights, and they're traveling great distances, and along the way, they need to have food sources available for them. And a lot of these species are undergoing, big declines, and they're getting hit on both ends. There could be habitat loss in breeding grounds, habitat loss in wintering grounds. But again, the decline of insect food sources, I don't know how much they're eating adult moths, but they're certainly relying heavily on the caterpillars for a lot of these moth species. They're coming through in early spring, and you can see them moving around the branches, just gleaning little caterpillars and other little insects off of the leaves and the twigs. But this chestnut-sided wobbler is another one that's experiencing declines. I think a lot of species, in the whole suite of neotropical migrants are declining. This one for sure is the Cerulean Wobbler. They've had major declines. And again, there's a lot of factors involved, but it has a direct relationship with moths. It needs these caterpillars, and that could be a factor in all of this. Bats too. Bats have other problems going on. With white nose syndrome. We're losing, little brown myotis, down 90% in some places and stuff. They've pretty much disappeared from the Charlotte area. And again, we know moths are a big food source for bats, so that's another contributing factor. If you're getting hit with one thing and you're losing a food source, that's a big concern. So, when you tie it all together, these moths have very important roles that they're playing, even if it just means being a food source for bats and birds and other wildlife. Things you don't think about, decomposition. There's a whole group of moths in the Erebidae family that are known as the litter moths. And they call them litter moths because the caterpillars feed on leaf litter, and they're helping decompose leaves and break down leaves. This yellow spotted renia is a common litter moth in our area. There's the caterpillar in the upper left. But just doing things that we just don't even think about, just other functional roles in the environment. So you can think about many things. You walk through a grassland or a meadow, and probably moths is not the first thing you're thinking of. For us, because our head is in moths a lot of the time. We can walk through something like this, and it does, trigger that thought that, yeah, and you don't see them, but in the adult stage and in the caterpillar stage, they're involved in this. They're playing important roles in this. Those caterpillars are feeding on certain grass species. They're an important food source for birds and other wildlife of meadows. And same is true of woodlands. You walk through our forested areas, moths is not something that comes into your head right away, but they're out there. They're doing very functional things in these environments, and they're super important. So in the great web of life, if you look at this connection between our plants and wildlife, they're all interconnected. They all need each other. They're all doing important things. And you pull pieces away, and it starts to affect, others surviving, and eventually, you lose too many pieces, and the whole system kind of breaks down. But in this whole interconnection thing, you can see right there. I'll circle it with my mouse. There's a moth. They drew it to make it look, it sort of looks like a butterfly. I'm sure they were going for a moth. I'm sure it's a moth. No. But vanishing moths, so that, that's one of the big issues going on with insects is, they play these important roles. And now there's a big fear that we're not seeing nearly as many as we used to, moths and other insects in general as well. So the great E.O. Wilson, had this quote, and we lost him just a couple of months ago, but he's done incredible work with insects for his whole career. But and he's got many great quotes. And just such a great scientist. But one of the ones when you're thinking about insects and moths and declines, he said, if we were to wipe out insects alone on this planet, the rest of life and humanity with it would mostly disappear from the land within a few months. I mean, that, if you try and take that in to think about how quickly everything would be affected if you pulled moths out of the equation, and of course, and other insects as well. But moths are a very diverse group. So when we're thinking about our insect fauna, moths are a major part of that. And what's scary is that there's been a lot of research lately that kind of really paints a picture for insect numbers crashing dramatically over the last few decades. So this was a study that was done a few years ago that was published. It was a study that was done in Germany, and they were looking at some of their nature reserves over, I think it was a 25-year period, and they were collecting insects and just actually weighing insects as complete biomass. So they weren't separating species out or something. They were just actually collecting them in bulk and weighing them. But they found a 75% decrease in insect biomass over a 25-year period. 75%, I mean, that is beyond significant. And around that same time, this study came out from France looking at some bird populations and finding major declines there as well. Some species declining over by a third, some more than that, especially some of the insect-eating species. So again, all these little studies that, are published in, scientific peer-reviewed journals that get attention among the scientific community, really, start setting off some alarm bells. But, for the general public, they're not really seeing this information or getting it, until this happened. All of a sudden, New York Times ran this magazine cover in 2018, November 2018. And this story was titled "The Insect Apocalypse is Here." So, this was based on those two, as well as several other studies that have happened recently. And, just, anecdotal stuff too, talking about how we don't see dead moths and insects on the windshields when we drive through, drive through the country the way we used to years ago. So, it's starting to get some big attention at levels that we didn't expect. And it's scary. I mean, you think about E.O. Wilson's quote, what could happen if we keep losing insects at the rate that we're losing them? So then it's like that, well, what can we do about this kind of thing? And, for us and the role I play, we're trying to protect habitat. So again, that mouthful that I said at the beginning, I work for Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation's Division of Nature Preserves and Natural Resources. Came out a little smoother the second time. But our mission is to protect the region's biodiversity and natural heritage for its inherent value and for the benefit of future generations by promoting open space preservation, conserving natural communities, and fostering awareness and stewardship through environmental education and outdoor recreation. And, we do all these things, and, we do them well over our 8,000 acres of nature preserve land. But, the most important words in there, I think, right on the first line is biodiversity, of which insects are a major part of that. And, of that insect group, of course, moths are as well. And then third line down is the conserving natural communities part. So that's really, I think, the way we're trying to go about it is, we have all this nature preserve land, and, we have these natural community types that exist. And natural communities are really an assemblage of native plants and wildlife that function together in a system. And that's really where our biodiversity exists, is within these functional natural communities. So conserving them and managing them takes a lot of work. So, some of our staff are focused, they spend all their time, in this battle to really keep our nature preserves, or more specifically, the natural communities in our nature preserves, in the greatest conditions and the highest quality that they possibly can be. And it's just tons of work. When we get properties, a lot of them look like this. And, for people that don't know, you walk through the woods and you just see green and, it's great. There's trees and there's shrubs and everything like that. But invasive species are a major issue. So a lot of our properties, if you're not actively managing them, they just get overrun with invasive species. And this is autumn olive elaeagnus that's kind of formed the whole shrub layer. And once that happens, you're crowding out native vegetation. And again, those moths have those relationships with the native vegetation. So native plants start disappearing, native insects start disappearing, and again, it affects that whole system from functioning properly. So you can protect land, but if you're not managing it, it doesn't have, it's not functioning the way it should. You're losing the key components of these natural communities. So unmanaged sites have lower biodiversity, and managed sites have higher biodiversity. So this is a managed oak savanna at Latta Nature Preserve. And you can just see there's just the diversity of, flowering species in there. And there's going to be a much greater diversity and abundance of insect species in there as well. So it takes a lot of work to get from, something, like that to like that. But, that's the challenge of, having nature preserves and, wanting to keeping them in the highest quality as possible. It's a constant battle and it's constant work. And then, just that fight against invasive species goes on and on and on. This is a volunteer taking out Chinese tallow tree from one of our properties. Some volunteers came for a big cleanup of English ivy, and it just goes on and on and on. Probably the best tool we have for manage, besides, the battle against invasive species, and manually removing them and doing that kind of work, the easiest way to manage large acreage is through in our area, is definitely through the use of prescribed fire. A lot of invasive plant species didn't come from places that had fire as a major part of the landscape to the way, we have here. And fire has been part of our environment, certainly for hundreds of years, probably longer than that. Native Americans, had been burning regularly much of this part of the state. When, Europeans first came through here, they wrote stories about this being, as describing it as the Grand Savannah, describing it as, a prairie. There were bison here at one point in time. So there's all these accounts of our area not being closed canopy mature forest. There was certainly some open component to it. And most of our native plant species are well adapted to having periodic fire on the landscape. And a lot of our invasive plants are not. So doing this, just setting fire to our natural areas actually helps control invasive plant species and encourages, young growth, and opens up our woodlands and brings a diversity of flowering species back into the mix. And I guess it can be fun. Some of our staff enjoy setting things on fire, but it's a lot of work too. And a lot of our staff spend a lot of time preparing fire lines and preparing our nature preserves to, have these periodic burns. And right now we're in the thick of our burn season. But besides that management work, we can do all that work and we can try and keep our natural areas in the best quality and condition as they can be. But then we have to figure out, what's there, is it working? Are we seeing a great diversity of species and stuff? And over the years, we've gotten a really good handle on our diversity of vertebrate species for sure, thinking about birds, reptiles, amphibians, mammals. For the invertebrates or the insect groups, it's been a lot harder. We have a pretty good handle on things like butterflies. We're just bumped up over 100 species, dragonflies as well. I think we're about somewhere about 75 species between dragonflies and damselflies. But moths was the great unknown, and it just seemed like an area that we were going to have to, dive into sooner or later. What's great about moths, as opposed to any other group, is you really can you can turn on a light and they come to you. So that makes them a little bit of an easier subject to study, which is different than most other groups of insects. But the Mecklenburg County Moth Nights program has been one that's been going on for a while. And again, this is how we've built up this knowledge base of moths over time. So I'm gonna tell the story about how this all started. And it started with one person. So this gentleman in the foreground, this is Taylor Pehoff. He's a great local naturalist, great knowledge of everything. And he was working with our group for a while. And he was the one who started, just keeping a little moth list. And, Taylor would look at moths at Porchlight Bower office or at his house and, started building up a little list of moths he was seeing. And, it started getting bigger and the list was growing and, had 100 species, then probably a little more than that. And then there was this night, this fateful night, which I can lower this bar from my screen so I can see it. July 30th, 2011, the first annual North Carolina Moth Night. So put this back up, by the way. So this was new for our area. In Europe, they've been having these kind of moth nights, they call them, for a long period of time. And it's become almost like a competition in some areas there, where they go out at night and with sheets and black lights and look at moths and see who can find the most moths. But we hadn't had anything like that here. So this was probably the first time that people formally came together as some kind of structured moth night event ever, in North Carolina. And, there were groups out in the Triangle, and I'm sure there was a group out in the mountains. We had our group in the Charlotte area. And, we wanted to get more than, the group in the Triangle, of course, and stuff. I don't think we did, unfortunately, but we had fun. But for a lot of us, we had our kids with us and stuff. We were seeing these things for the first time. And, we had a simple setup. We had a cord that we strung up between two trees and put some bed sheets over it. I think we had the black lights hooked up to a car battery with a car parked in the middle of the field. But we had this, we were taking pictures of things and trying to figure out what we were looking at. And we had this little list of moths by the end of the moth night. And it was a lot of fun, and it was definitely a learning experience for us. And from there, we decided we would kind of keep doing this thing. What happens if we went to different nature preserves? And, would we find different species, and, we needed some new equipment in order to do that. So there was a company called BioQuip. They were an entomological supply company that had been around for 75 years that sadly just closed their doors about 2 weeks, or maybe even just a week ago. But they were our supplier for our moth night equipment. So they had these moth sheets that were on a frame that you could just fold up with a portable battery, and you can just get these things out anywhere. So we can get deep into the woods, and we can get into the denser part of our nature preserves and set up moth sheets and just go out there and see what would be attracted and look at the different species. So the list started to grow, and we just kept getting more and more. And, we started doing these moth nights regularly. But I think it was, let's see, do I have the dates on any of these? I think it was 2012 to 2019 or 2018, where we would do actually once a month from March through October, and usually each month we were at a different nature preserve. And again, just taking pictures and documenting all these moths that we were seeing. And it was incredible. It was a lot of fun. And there's the picture I was looking for. Yeah, so held monthly from March to October from 2012 to 2018. So that was it. And besides actually just being out there with the sheets and black lights, we would also put some moth bait on some trees. We call it mung, and it's a kind of simple concoction, I guess you will. I mean, everyone's got their own little secret recipe and they add some extra ingredients. But for us, we went with a basic recipe, which was rotten bananas, stale beer, brown sugar, and molasses. Make a big slurry of this stuff, and you could take a paintbrush and paint it onto the trees, and moths would be attracted to this at night. Excuse me one sec. I have a dog behind me that's laying on the floor snoring. So if you're hearing a weird sound, that's what it is. But not all moths are attracted to black light. So some of them actually just go to this bait and they don't show up on our sheets. So it was a way too for us to find some different species that we weren't getting at the sheets. Like American Idia is one that loves to be on the bait. American Bird's Wing is one that we've only seen on our moth bait and not on the sheets. This is an Abbott Sphinx, another beautiful one that we found on moth bait. And sometimes if we're not in a good place to paint trees, we can at least, take some ropes and kind of stick them into the bucket full of mung, and then we'll just kind of hang it up on a tree leaf or something like that. And they'll love that as well. So what does that say on there? Turn on your black light. So this is a play on, if you know the song, Turn On Your Love Light, turn on your black light and they will come to you. So it's just incredible what, you just go out and do something like this, and the diversity of moths and other insects as well that you'll find coming to your black light and sheet. So I usually get asked about, about black light and if you need black light in order to do mothing. but you can really use any type of light. So regular light bulbs, you know, at your porch light, whether it's an incandescent light bulb or compact fluorescent or something like that, they all work. Moths are attracted to any light, but there's something about black light. That ultraviolet light just kind of carries out further, and you're pulling in moths from further away. Even probably better than that are the mercury vapor lights. They are super bright, and they'll pull in moths from a further distance as well. So this is our mercury vapor light setup. I prefer not to use these. I prefer black light. They're super bright. They can actually probably do some eye damage if you look into them long enough. If rain hits them and you don't have a good cover on them, they could explode, which is a problem. But our biggest problem that we tend to have with them is that they're so bright. A lot of times the police will show up during our moth nights because somebody sees this weird light and they call the police. And that's what happens. We usually don't get that. The black light doesn't seem to bring the police the way the mercury vapor light does. But you know, even if you're not using mercury vapor and using black light, you still get an incredible diversity of moths for sure. So let's take a look at some of these moths. So you have two groups. Banjo, wait up. The macro moths versus the micro moths. So you know, we're seeing such diversity on our sheets. You got to kind of have some way to start separating things out. So the micros are the little moths, and I'll show you what I mean in a second by little. And of course, the macros are the larger moths. So this is a giant leopard moth in this picture. It's about 4 centimeters long, wingspan 5.7 to 9.1 centimeters. And you can see the size of it there on my finger. That's a macro moth. So a lot of them, the micros are much, much smaller than that. You know, they call that giant leopard moth, even though I know it doesn't look that big. But some of them are really small. So this is the Suzuki's promolactis. This is it on one of our moth sheets, and that square is about 5 millimeters wide, which I think if you equate that to inches, it's like 0.2 inches. So, you know, under 1/4 inch wide. These things are tiny. And they just, you know, if you're looking at them from standing even like back a few feet, they just look like little specks until you get up close. But then you can see the interesting, you know, they same way as the bigger moths, have really unique colors and patterns and everything. So beautiful. I mean, tiny, but beautiful little creatures. And the same could be said for this sculptured moth, you know, slightly larger. This one's probably like 7 millimeters, but again, doesn't look like much. But when you get up close and take some pictures and start blowing up the pictures, you really see some of the incredible markings and designs and colors and patterns that are on these tiny little moths. And again, you know, no less important, have those same functional roles in the environment, even though they're really small, they're doing important things. So this is the white spotted leaf roller. This is one of what we call the tortricid moths, or the torts, kind of shield-shaped little moths, but I mean, beautiful markings on these things. So we don't see this one too often, but this showed up this past spring at one of our moth nights. Beautiful little species. The Schlager's fruitworm moth is also a micro moth. We're getting a little bigger, so you can see on this now we're kind of almost close to 15 millimeters. But this is one that belongs to a group of moths known as the bird dropping moths. And their whole existence in the adult form is to kind of mimic bird poo, because who wants to eat bird poo? Nobody, I guess. So that's how they disguise themselves in the daytime. They just look like a little bird dropping, you know, on the vegetation. And usually we'll get left alone. So this is a macro moth. This is a tulip tree beauty. And again, you know, you look at one of these little squares, and we were talking about 5 millimeters, you can see how much bigger some of these macro moths are. So not much coloration on this tulip tree beauty, but the beauty part definitely comes from just the markings and designs and patterns that they have on their wings. Incredible creatures. The one spotted variant, you know, they belong to a family known as the Geometridae, and they usually hold their wings straight out. So this one spotted variant is one of them. Another member of this family is the Somber Carpet. Again, not much for coloration, but the patterning is beautiful. And again, great names. The bad wing is part of this group, this little pistachio colored moth. And then you have the Saturnids, the silk moths. These little fuzzy headed things some members of this group are really big. This rosy maple moth is on the small end, but beautiful, incredible colors. And they call it the cotton candy moth is its nickname. But some other members of this group is the Io moth with these incredible eye spots on their hind wing. And, there's different thoughts on the purpose of these, but, a lot of times you expect that when they open their forewings real quick and flash those eye spots, it might just temporarily confuse a predator into thinking that this is a bigger animal than it is. And in that second of confusion, maybe the moth has a chance to flit away. The pink striped oak worm is a member of this group, again, of that really cute fuzzy orange head. And then there's the Regal Moth. So again, incredible markings and colors on this one. I'm not going to have a chance to get really into caterpillars during this talk, but just if I have to highlight one caterpillar, it has to be the hickory horndevil, the caterpillar of the Regal Moth. This is our largest caterpillar in North America. Incredible with these spines, and this thing looks ferocious. It looks very dangerous. It looks poisonous, and there are certainly a lot of poisonous caterpillars around, but this is not one of them. So it's just there it's all show. It's all bark and no bite, so you can pick them up and hold them like I'm doing in this picture. And then probably one of our largest species is the Imperial Moth, but again, beautiful markings. And here's my son holding one at one of our Moth Nights. So, some of these things you can actually pick up and hold them. And it's where do you have these kinds of experiences? It's just incredible. The Nottuidae is probably our most diverse family of mackerel moths. A lot of them have a triangular or arrowhead type shape. There's this yellow striped armyworm, or the got these names covered up here. The implicit arches, just a beautiful species. The laugher, the burdock borer, and then the sphinx moths. And you have the rustic sphinx, the walnut sphinx, blinded sphinx, I believe. I got this panel covered. Yeah, this one. The Pandora Sphinx is one of my favorites, one of most people's favorites, just an incredibly patterned and beautifully colored moth. And then there's the greater grapevine looper, or wait a minute, is it the lesser grapevine looper? So we don't know. There's nothing on this moth by looking at it that'll tell us which one of these two species it is. And that's actually true for a bunch of moths. There's nothing morphologically that separates one from either another closely related species, or maybe there's a few in one genus that are all very closely related that, there's no markings or patterns or anything, size or anything that you can truly differentiate which species it is. So, for us, we're trying to catalog our diversity of moth species that we have in the county. So it really helps to kind of figure out which species we're looking at. So for some of these, you have to do a bit of a deeper dive to really try to figure out what you're looking at. And that deeper dive entails taking off their abdomen and dissecting it and pulling out their genitalia and looking at the structure and design of their genitalia. There are some technical publications that have great scientific illustrations of moth genitalia. And that's actually where you can differentiate species, is by looking at their genitalia. It's a delicate process though, and not knowing how to dissect moth genitalia for identification purposes. What we did several years ago is we brought in the expert, and this gentleman standing is Bo Sullivan. He's definitely the leading moth expert in North Carolina, and of course one of our best lepidopterists in the state. And he came to Reedy Creek Nature Preserve and gave us a moth genitalia dissection workshop. And I can guarantee that it was the only moth genitalia dissection workshop that's ever happened in this region, ever. Maybe it never will again. But a few of us got together and, we went through this process and, checked it out and, got these things under scopes and had a chance to try our hand at it and stuff like that. And it's a lot of work. So we've done some of this. We've actually gone through this process and have figured out species, based on dissecting the genitalia. But we actually have a whole bunch more moths that we're holding on to until we get some quiet time where we can jump back into this and do it again. Like I said, we balance a bunch of different responsibilities, so it's hard to find time to dissect moth genitalia, but we are planning on, hopefully at some point soon, having a block of time that we can dive back into this. So when we're not dissecting moth genitalia, we can usually figure out their names using the resources that are available for most moths, like I said. So it was hard at first. When we first got into this, the main book that was available was this Field Guide to Moths. This was the standard. And if you flip through, this is what it looked like. They showed moths in pinned position, like they would be in a scientific collection. Some of the plates were in color, some were in black and white. And this is really all we had to go by, and it was hard for a lot of things we were looking at. And we were always hoping they'd come out with a field guide to show moths in the way we're actually seeing them on the sheet, like when we take pictures of them and stuff. And then it finally happened. So Peterson Field Guide to Moths came out. And this one that I'm showing this picture was to northeastern North America. And I think it may have been like 2013, 2014, this book came out, maybe like 2014. And we were incredibly excited. So this was the first time, we had a field guide that showed them the way they would actually look on a sheet or at your porch light, not with their wings pinned open in a scientific collection. And just to back up, a couple of years after that, they actually did come out with a southeastern version of that. So we were even more excited. But besides this book, other resources started to develop. So Bug Guide is a great, incredible resource. So bugguide.net for anything insect related. But for moths, you can go through a species and there'd be tons of pictures on there for each species, which you don't really get that opportunity with a field guide, because there's a lot of variation for some species, even in, not just between males and females, but just variation in patterning and coloring, just for one single species. And there's so many species too, which makes it tough. But a great resource, having that available, and also having some life history information on there too for moths, and that's information on their host plants and that kind of thing. A complementary website that came out that really started gaining steam around the same time was Moth Photographers Group. And this, has range maps where you can actually see if this moth you're even looking at has really been documented in your area or not. And what's really great about them is they have these plate series where you can go through and toggle through, pictures of all, and you can actually separate, you can go by one region, you can pick a state, or you can just do the Southeast. And you just go flipping through plates of each moth family just for the members that occur in that defined region. And it's comprehensive. So every species is in there. So it really helps, you have a picture of something, you just flipping through these plates and you go through them long enough and finally you might find your moth. But again, it still takes a lot of work to do that. But incredible resource that just wasn't there until, we started jumping into the moth game. This started taking off. And then, a few years ago, Moths of North Carolina, we had and this was part of the North Carolina Biodiversity Project, and just incredible resource. And especially for us in the moth world to have something like this, where, we have great moth information just for North Carolina. So you can see there's a range map that shows you where moths have been documented in the state. And again, it's got information on them, flight periods. Harry LeGrand, incredible zoologist in the state, is mastermind behind this whole series of websites. And for this one in particular, Bo Sullivan has contributed incredible information, and Steve Hall as well. It's incredible having these resources available now. I don't know what we would do without it. And then it really started picking, just a couple of years ago, like Facebook became a place you could go to for information on moths. So these two pages, Mothing and Moth Watching and Moths of the Eastern United States. Now you have something where you can take a picture of a moth, put it on there, and like within 15 minutes, some moth expert somewhere in the country is telling you what it is. And that's like really cool. So, that's a whole nother level of stuff that again, was never there when we jumped into this, back in 2012. And then iNaturalist came along. So, taking it a level up too, iNaturalist exists for everything, plants, anything, fungi, insects, you name it. you take a picture of anything in the natural world, put it on there, and there's a whole bunch of experts for all different taxa that will be able to confirm what you have or put an identification to what you have. And it's incredible. It's incredible to be at this point where we have these kind of resources available to us. This moth thing, we got into this because we, again, are managing our nature preserves, and we want to understand the diversity of, life that's here. We want to make sure, if insect populations are really declining the way they are, that we're documenting things before they're gone. And if there's things that we're seeing that we're not seeing many of, and we understand what's there, and if we can learn about their relationships to what plant species they need, we can make sure we're protecting the right kind of habitat, for these insects, which could be in steep decline. And again, we wouldn't even know that unless we were doing things like these moth nights and stuff. So, this is all part of managing for biodiversity. So for us, it was for those purposes. But in doing so, you can't help but build an appreciation just for them, on a surface level, like just saying these things are just unique and beautiful and fun to look at. And other people started, with them, I guess, because more and more resources for identification became available, more and more people started getting interested in these things. So, we had our moth nights that we would do mostly for a few of us to geek out together and build our moth list for the county. But, people are like, hey, what are you doing? And we would tell them, they're like, that sounds interesting. So we would invite people to come and check it out. And then I guess that are all around the country there, people were getting curious about this kind of thing, because National Moth Week kicked off in 2012. And, we were excited about this national, let's do a thing for this, So for the first time, we really had our first public moth night. We did it at West Branch Nature Preserve, where instead of just focusing on, geeking out and, just really cataloging moths and photographing, we would take the time to talk to people about moths at the sheet and show them and talk about how cool they look and that kind of thing, and geek out with other people. And people, and it was incredible. Everyone who came, was like, I can't, was seeing things they had never seen before. And it was a lot of fun. So we've had an event for National Moth Week every year that it's happened. And now it's had its 10th year anniversary. So usually we'll do something at West Branch Nature Preserve, and, and think some of the pictures coming up, you'll see some of the other public moth nights we've done as well. But it's just great that, people are really taking the time to build up an appreciation for these things, especially at a time where, insects are in the trouble that they're in right now. We need people to learn, we need people to appreciate, and then, that old saying, if you don't really protect something unless you've learned to appreciate it first. So this is one of another National Moth Week event that we did, Ann Springs Close Greenway in South Carolina. And again, they're always the same, when people come, and, it's this great opportunity to show them things that, that we've been seeing. And, there's always things even with some of these moths, diversity is so high, we can't even remember all their names. And I certainly can't. So, a lot of times we're seeing moths, and, we're like, oh yeah, I know, I remember, I've seen this one. And we're flipping through books with people, and they're like, I think it's this one. I'm like, yes. And they get excited. So, we're discovering and we're learning together, which makes it a ton of fun. So then that big question, we've been doing this for so long, how many species are there? So in North Carolina, I think we're up to over 2,700 known species, in the state. But just for Mecklenburg County, as of today, on our official list, we're up to 928 species. And I say official list because we have a ton of backlog photos and specimens, and I know there's information out there that we can pull in from my naturalist, where people have seen moths in the county that we don't know about, that we can use that as documentation too. So when we take the time to go through this number is going to jump up, and I'm sure we're going to be over 1,000. And that sounds about right. Usually it's about 10 times the butterfly diversity, moths diversity is about 10 times butterfly diversity in a given area. So we're just over 100 species of butterflies, so we can expect to be just over 1,000 species of moths. So since we stopped kind of doing the moth nights on a monthly basis, we've kind of switched gears a little bit to, instead of just having a sheet and black light and standing out there, we've been using these moth traps like you see on the right that we can actually just leave deep out in the nature preserve, set them up in the daytime, leave them, come back the next day, and then go through them. So this is Stephanie Hedrick on the left, who is actually doing a study with these traps, kind of comparing moths found in some of our more urban nature preserves versus those that are a little more what we consider rural, and also kind of comparing some of the sites that have more invasive species over some of the sites that have less invasive species, and looking to see how this affects moth diversity. So when we open these traps, it's incredible, these things that we pull out. We take them all back with us to the Dr. James F. Matthews Center for Biodiversity Studies, which is located in the back of the Reedy Creek Nature Center. And this is where the magic happens. So this is where we start laying these things out. Here's Stephanie kind of sorting through some of these moths that we've collected from the moth traps. They're laid out here on pinning boards that you can see. And then eventually they'll be, Stephanie's has been spending a lot of time pinning these moths and labeling them. And then they're going to go into our permanent collection, which again is housed in the zoological collection room at the Dr. James F. Matthews Center for Biodiversity Studies. So we have a great herbarium, which is just getting ready to hit 50,000 specimens. And our moth collection, it just hit 2,000 specimens. So, major milestones on both ends for us. But this is what it looks like. So the goal is to have a few specimens for every species, preferably a couple of males, a couple of females. There is so much that's still not known, and their taxonomy is constantly changing on these moths. So what we think is a species now, 3 years from now, might get split out into 3 species. And if you have a picture, that's good, but sometimes you need to actually have this specimen to help you with those identification issues. So there's things that you just can't see from a picture that might help you say it's this species or another species. There's even things they can do where they can pull off, a leg and do some DNA barcoding on that. And they've been able to differentiate species doing that kind of thing. But again, you need specimens. And it's also documenting, things that could be disappearing, so some of these species might not be here 20 or 30 years from now. And we want that record of once what was. This is a record of the life of natural life that exists in Mecklenburg County that may not be there at some point in the future. So it's important to have that documented. So again, back to our Moth Night celebrations, besides doing the moth trapping activities that we're doing, we're still setting up the sheets and black lights, more so for a lot of these kind of educational events like I talked about. So here we are at West Branch Nature Preserve for our annual Moth Night, which happens during National Moth Week in July. We'll do some educational stuff too, where we'll go out for, like, this is at McDowell Nature Preserve for the Nature at Night Festival. And we had a moth booth set up and, had a great time telling people about moths, and had a sheet set up. We didn't get many, but there were a couple of people were excited. And that's my daughter. She's the moth assistant for activities such as this. And then partnering with groups, like the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and the local chapters for hosting Moth Night events and that kind of thing. So this is one we did a couple of years ago with Concord Wildlife Alliance. This was at Woodland Discovery. And just a couple from this past summer, we had a Moth Night at Reedy Creek for North Carolina Wildlife Federation's Women in Conservation Leadership Program. We did a Moth Night with Outdoor Afro Charlotte. So again, just a great opportunity to get people out and experiencing, different kind of nature-related activities and building that appreciation and awareness for these insects. We're taking the time to learn about them, and it's great for us, and it's helping, in our overall understanding of our nature preserves. But to have the ability to actually pass on out knowledge and appreciation is great. So we love to have the opportunity to do that whenever we can. And sometimes we'll take that show on the road. So my moth knowledge really has been for the Piedmont, where we've been mothing in Mecklenburg County. But, when you go a couple hours away, into different regions of the state, you're going to see a different diversity of moths. So, you go up into the mountains where there's, the flora diversity is different. You can expect that you're going to have different moth diversity. And it's great to be able to do that. So, we went for a couple of years for the Great Blue Ridge Outdoor Adventure Weekend, which had been a thing that had been going on for decades at Wild Acres. And, you go up there and you see the hickory tussock moth. And some of these things that we never see in Mecklenburg County, like the cherry scallop shell. Azalea Sphinx is far more common in the mountains. I've yet to see it in the county. So it's great. So Color Native Plant Conference is an incredible event. We did some moth nights there a couple of years ago, and we'll be there this July as well. And again, same kind of thing, some of these things that we just don't see by us, that you drive a couple hours and all of a sudden, oh, look, a peppered moth, these beautiful creatures. It's just incredible. The white stripe, names covered, was the white stripe black moth. Yeah, white stripe black moth. The unadorned carpet, just these cool things that we don't see by us. And then, some like this beautiful showy emerald, we do get them in Mecklenburg County, but, sometimes the diversity for certain species is much higher in a different region. And I think that's probably the case for showy emerald in the mountains. So the very last thing I'll talk about before we close out, because people always wonder this, and I get asked this a lot, what's going on in the daytime? Where are these creatures? And they're out there. We just don't see them as much, but there are day-flying moth species. So this climbing moth is an example of that. You can actually see them flying around the daytime. They have this bold black and white coloration that makes them pretty visible when they're fluttering and landing on a leaf. But for the vast majority of moths, that we know are nocturnal, it's amazing how they just disappear from the landscape in the daytime. So we saw this one earlier, this is the tulip tree beauty moth, incredible. And again, you see that incredible patterning on there, and you don't really think about what that's for until you see it in the daytime, where it's on a tree like this, and it's amazing how well these moths disappear and can camouflage themselves. So again, there's no way an artist can appreciate that quality that they have. Just to be able to blend into the environment, this colorful zolly blending into the tree bark. This tree, I don't know if you can see it, actually has 3 moths on it. And I saw a moth fly in and land on this tree. I'm like, oh wow, it looked like it disappeared. As we were standing there looking, it's like there's another one and another one. So hard to see, but there's one here. There's one here, and there's one up here. There's a close-up of all 3. So this belongs to a group called the Underwing Moths. For a lot of people that are into moths, that's one of their favorite groups. And again, that kind of cryptic patterning on the forewings that helps blend them into tree bark, makes them disappear. But when they open up, and this is an Ilia underwing, you get this cool, bright patterning on their underwings, and that's, I guess, why they're called underwing moths. For some of them just have black and tan underwings, but for some of them, like this pendant, it's just this cool bright coloration that you see as soon as they open up. And this was at my front porch. And sometimes they don't do a good job blending. But actually this Luna moth, we were fortunate, we had just seen it eclose, where it just comes out of the pupa stage. And it had sat and it pumped its blood, which is hemolymph, through its wings. And it's just incredible to watch that process. And then it fluttered, and it took we watched it take its first flight, land on the bark of this tree. It only stayed there for a moment, and then it did fly up into the tree leaves, where I'm sure that green coloration just made it disappear. So again, great to have. And I mean, even when you're not thinking about moths, we were just walking through the woods, we have this great moth moment out of nowhere. But yes, one of the take-home messages is there is so much to discover and so much to learn, and it's ongoing. We're building our list, we're building our knowledge. Tara dared to say moth expert. I am certainly no moth expert, but she is right in saying I am a moth enthusiast. And there's no way you can do this kind of stuff for a number of years and not be, because they're incredible creatures, and we learn how important they are, and we know what it means to our natural environment to have them there. So thank you for going through all that and taking the time to, listen to all this information. And it's a lot. And, I think I say every presentation I end up doing that there's just so much that I want to put in, and there's so much that I end up having to leave out. But that's certainly true for moths. Even though it's just one subject, you can really go on and on about them. And I did. And thank you for taking the time to listen. So any questions that you want to throw in the chat?
Thank you, Lenny. This was phenomenal. I don't think I need to say much more than that. I'm sure we are all intense mothers now after this hour of moths. So really, thank you. And we do have a lot of good questions. So we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes. And any others, do you mind if we send that your way and you can email them back after?
Oh, yeah.
Is that okay, Lenny?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great. Perfect. So we will kind of jump on in. I have seen wax moths in my beehives, but never outside in nature. Where do they live as adults?
That's a good question. I feel like we've only seen, I don't know how much they're attracted to light. I know we've documented them before, but I feel like we do not see them that much in the county. And again, where are they? That's one of them. They're out there disappearing, in the daytime. But yeah, we've seen them before, but it's not, I feel like, a moth that's really common for us, at least not at black lights in our sheets during our moth nights. But,
thank you, Lenny.
Yeah.
Good question there.
Yeah.
We have a question from Kathy. I had learned a long time ago that the difference between moths and butterflies was how they hold their wings when at rest. Moths have wings spread out horizontal and butterflies hold their wings up vertically. Is that correct?
Butterflies will do both. So there are some that will keep their wings straight out, and there's some that will fold them up over their back. Moths in general tend to have wings open, but we've seen moths close up as well. And even when we're doing the moth nights at the sheet, some of the geometrids that tend to always have their wings wide open, when they land on the sheet, they'll just look completely like butterflies with their wings folded up. And we just watch them going, can you open up already, please, so we can identify you? Because you just can't tell until they do. So generalizations, but yes, that's true in general, but there's exceptions on both ends for sure.
Thanks, Lenny. And I had to mention to you, I need to get those pictures from you. I love those two pictures that you shared that I was in. So I'm clearly a moth fan. So yeah, I need to get those from you because those were amazing pictures. All right, we have a question from Michael. How do you get better at finding moths? I found a Pandora Sphinx moth on our deck last year. I can't imagine locating one in a natural location. Yeah,
that's a species that tends to just show up in weird places. And we normally don't get Pandora Sphinx on our moth nights, but I have had a Pandora Sphinx right outside my porch, at the light one time. So it's kind of weird, how come we're not seeing them during our moth nights? But the best thing you could, if you want to see more moths, it's just the light. So if you can use a black light, that works better. Wavelength carries further out, you'll have more moths coming to you, but leaving any light on at night and kind of going out and taking a peek, you'll definitely see some moths. If you want to up your game a little bit too, you can put out some of that moth bait. And like I said, our basic recipe was, a slurry of stale beer, rotten banana, brown sugar, and molasses. Other people have little special ingredients that they put in. They won't tell you what they use. I know some people use peaches and other stuff, but you can try something like that too. And of course, that'll bring in some moths as well. So yeah, putting out some special baits for them and the lights, especially black light. And you'll get them. But Pandora Sphinx is one of those ones that, we don't see it that much, and then all of a sudden it pops up out of nowhere. Yeah. Beautiful moth.
Thank you, Lenny. And I think you answered Terry's question right there about the ingredients for the moth slurry. So awesome. You kind of read their mind right there. Kathy's asking, how can we organize a moth night event?
If you would like to do one with us, that would be great. I guess the best thing to do, if you can't get in touch with me directly, and if you have and Tara or any of the Wildlife Federation chapters, we can kind of set one up together through something like that. Our public moth night that we host ourselves, though, that is every July at West Branch Nature Preserve. So that you can find out through Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation's website, and it's listed on there. I think it's usually advertised as a program through Reedy Creek Nature Center, but that definitely happens every July on our end. But yeah.
Awesome. That's so exciting that there's someone else who wants to host a moth night. So very, very cool. We have a question from Wilson. Can you recommend a good guide for converting your landscape at your house from exotic to native vegetation? Which exotics are really bad and which natives are really good to plant? That sort of information.
I'm sure there's, like a Doug Tallamy guide, I'm sure would be great for something like that. He's got great books for that.
Yep.
But basically,
I was thinking the native plants of the Southeast, which is a Melichamp book too. Just throwing that one out there.
Yeah. And Dr. Melichamp, he's also involved in our Center for Biodiversity Studies and comes in regularly. So yes, his book, that would be a great book for sure. Basically, the more natives you can plant and the more invasive you can remove always work out better. Because again, these insects have evolved, they have these relationships with these plant species. And it's like, some people plant natives and you might get upset that the leaves are getting chewed apart, but that's what you want. I mean, that's what needs to happen when your leaves are getting chewed. That's a good thing. I mean, I know that's not necessarily true for certain garden plants and stuff, but for other native plants that you're going to put in your yard, because then that plant is playing a functional role. It has that relationship with its host species and stuff. So yeah, you want that.
So true. Thank you. We have a question from Ken. Have you done any collection per unit effort calculations to estimate potential size for some of these species populations in your area?
No, we have not done anything like that.
Good
so
question.
We're really still at the point where, we're working on diversity. We're still trying to figure out, all the species that we have. And I think the next thing we want to do after that is to kind of be able to do some studies where we're putting out traps or even if we do by sheet at the same place at a certain time interval and seeing, especially over a number of years, how things are changing, if we're doing it at the same time, same, weather conditions and that kind of thing, same location, because we want to see what's going on with these populations. We're still trying to figure out what we have. And once we feel like we can really get a good handle on that, then it's going to see like what's going on with these species. Are they losing them or, is there stuff moving in here that we haven't seen before, or stuff that were common starting to disappear? Anecdotally, by doing these moth nights, I feel like there's things I've seen a number of years ago that seem to be pretty common, and we're just not seeing many of them anymore. I haven't been doing it long enough to understand if there's just natural cycles for a lot of these, but it definitely seems to change from year to year. And just, we weren't working with numbers at all. We were just really trying to document species, and even that, we barely have enough time to do. And I have a ton of backlog of moth night photos to go through and stuff like that. But we haven't been working with abundance or anything like that. So, I feel like, I know a number of years ago, sometimes in our big moth night, we would hit over 100 species, sometimes 120. And I feel like in the last couple of years, it might be more like 60, 70. We're just not seeing them the way we did. And I wish we could have done some stuff more related to abundance, but we're just not there just yet. And it takes, if we can have more moth dedicated staff in the county, like they need to hire like 3 or 4 positions of full-time mothers.
Or like a dozen, right?
Yeah, there we go. Won't happen anytime soon, but we're doing the best we can. But Ken, we'd love to be able to start doing stuff like that at some point. Just not there yet.
Good question. We have a question from Donna. She asked, how do moths get their crazy names?
I have no idea, but I love them. I mean, some of these moths have great names, and that's part of the appeal. It's just, when there's a moth called the Badwing and just, whatever, some of the slides, the horrid Zolly. They're great. So yeah.
Yeah, they're just really fun. Question from Gail, with BioQuip gone, where can we find the moth sheet set up?
I don't know. I actually panicked and placed a pretty large order about a month and a half ago and haven't even received anything yet. I'm not sure what they had left in stock, and I'm hoping that we receive something pretty soon from that. But yeah, I'm on some listservs too with the Entomological Society of America, and everyone's lost. This has been the main supplier for entomology supplies for everybody for a very long period of time, and they were the only place in town, really, in a larger town, to get this kind of stuff. So I don't know yet. We're going to have to do some research. I see people asking each other questions, entomologists saying, where can I get this? Where can I get that now? And people starting to mention some other companies that have some entomology supplies, but I haven't started looking into it yet. And I'm going to be scared. I don't know of anybody else that has something like this with the Moth Night equipment. So I'm a little scared. Right.
Wow. Yeah. Keep us in the loop, but actually don't keep us in the loop because you need them first. So
that's right. That's right. Yeah, I'm not telling you.
So keep it to yourself for now, right? Yeah. We have a question from Melody. What time of night are moths most active?
So it's really interesting. So whenever we do, a moth night, and especially when we do it for the public, I have to let them know that as soon as it turns dark, it's not like the sheet's covered with moths. So it definitely, there's a progression to it. So the first hour of darkness is really slow, and then we'll start usually seeing a few micro moths come in. And I would say, if we're thinking summer months, it's probably 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. is really a strong period. And then like you'll get all this, just all of a sudden you look in the sheets and things just appear out of nowhere. And then it'll kind of stabilize. So maybe between like 11 p.m. and midnight, everything's kind of the same on the sheets. And then all of a sudden after midnight, there's like another wave of stuff coming in. So like I know like some of the large imperial, like the beautiful imperial moths, that big yellow and brown one, usually don't show up on our sheets till close to midnight. And a lot of times when we're finishing out moth, I'd say we're by like 1 a.m. or so, we're kind of starting, things have kind of settled at that point again, and we're ready to start breaking down the sheets. We keep talking about doing an all-nighter because I know there's moths coming in later than that. I mean, maybe like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., whatever, that there's something that's just not appearing till the later hours of the night. But we haven't attempted that yet.
That sounds like a crazy moth party. Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it one day. We'll put little tents up and we'll take shifts or something like that. Yeah. It's gonna happen, but we haven't tried it yet. With the moth traps, it's hard to say. We end up with moths the next day, and it's hard to know what time they were coming in. But there definitely is, there are points where certain things appear, then there's a lull, and then there's another point where later in the night other things start to appear. So there's definitely cycles to it.
Very, very cool. And I just wanted to let everyone know we just have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to get to maybe one more question, and then I'll make sure to mark down any other questions that are coming in so that you can answer them after, if that's cool with you, Lenny. So thoughts on moths and light pollution. And I do see a few kind of comments in here. One is it better for moths to use motion detector outdoor lights so they aren't on all the time? So that was kind of a follow-up, I think, to some of that.
Yeah, so light's a major issue for them. So, even when we're doing the moth nights, we come to the understanding that, it's kind of good when we end, because there are moths that we'll see that come in, whatever, 10 o'clock or something like that. And once they settle on the sheet, they're there. They do not move. And, they should be out doing things, they're doing their active roles, whether they're pollinating, evening blooming flowers or fluttering around so that something can be eating them, or their functional role in the environment that they need to be doing, and not sitting on a sheet all night. So that's a big problem with light. So I think a lot of times when moths are attracted to light, especially light sources that are going to be on all night, those moths are going to stay there and they're not going to do anything. So I always get that question every moth night, what is it? Why did they come to the sheet and just stay there? And no one really knows. So the prevailing thought about moths and light is that, these insects have been around so long, where there was no artificial light. And, artificial light is a relatively new thing compared to, the evolution of moths and, how many thousands of years these things have been fluttering around at night. So, before there was artificial light, they're moving around by, the stars and the moon, that's how they're navigating. And, they can, have movements that, make them travel in certain distances or whatever it is that they're doing. I'm not sure what heights they fly at or that kind of thing. But those moon and stars are helping them navigate themselves and helping them travel. Now with artificial light, in the past, well, before artificial light, they could never reach those light sources, of course. But now with artificial light, they're reaching the light sources. So what happens, like at a sheet in a black light, is they're attracted, they come in, they've reached the moon. You know, in their mind, you know, this light that they're helping navigate them and attracting them, all of a sudden they're hitting this light source, which before was completely unreachable. So what happens when you're a moth and you reach the moon? You do nothing because you're out of information. You have nothing inside you to tell you what you do when you reach the moon. They're not wired for that. So not knowing what to do, they're out of information. They just do nothing. They just sit, and they could spend a whole night just sitting if it's a permanent light source that's on that night. So artificial light's a major problem for sure. Yeah. There are some animals that will take advantage of it that know to look around porch lights. Every moth night, you know, we get toads and frogs, and they just have a feast. And yeah, so you'll see other wildlife at your porch as well if you leave a light on for moths.
Thank you, Lenny. This was so amazing. I'm sure we all learned a ton. So really, thank you again for spending your time with us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, and I hope a lot of you get to actually go out there and meet him in person and go to a moth night, because they're super fun. And yeah, if you want to host one, get in touch with Lenny or me, and we can definitely give you the information that you need to know to do that. So yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, go ahead, Lenny.
Oh, sorry, I didn't think to put my contact information in the slide, but like I said, if you can contact Tara,
I'll put it in the follow-up email.
Oh, perfect. Yep, that's perfect.
Got it.
No,
perfect. Yeah. Thank you again. I hope you have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much to our moth expert, Lenny, here. And I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you all.
Thank you.